job at Homart, a place where he's well regarded by his colleagues who are unaware of his past. At lunch break, Robert sits with Ralphie. Ralphie, who's trying to become a security guard, receives help from Mr. McCall to manage his nutrition and physical exercise to achieve the necessary weight. Robert then hears a crunch, and his supposed tuna sandwich has hidden potato chips inside. Mr. McCall advises him to focus on gradual progress rather than immediate perfection. Robert, troubled by insomnia, spends many nights at a local diner. There, he sips tea and engrosses himself in books. He set himself the challenge of reading 100 books and is presently enjoying The Old Man and the Sea. Every night, he encounters a young girl who also frequents the diner. Their exchanges might be brief, but over time, they are gradually getting to know one another. Fast forward to the next day, and we find Mr. McCall going about his usual routine at work. A bunch of his colleagues swing by, admitting they've been making bets about his previous profession. Robert, with a twinkle in his eye, claims he was a pip, likening himself to the backup singers for Gladys Knight, and even busts a move to prove it. His workmates don't buy it, expecting something quite different. Nightfall brings Mr. McCall back to the diner, where the same girl joins him shortly after. She spots him with a fresh book and inquires about the finale of the previous one. Robert speaks about the book when their conversation is cut short by the arrival of a limo across the street from the diner. The girl receives a call from Slavi. Despite her reluctance, she heads outside to jump into a limo. The following evening, Robert again spots the girl at the diner. She joins him at his table, introducing herself as Alina. When Robert asks about the bruise on her face, she shrugs it off, claiming it was just a result of some silly mishap. She has dreams of becoming a singer and gives Mr. McCall a CD with some of her own music. Robert tells her she can become anything she wants. Alina notices a wedding ring on Robert's finger, but instead learns about his late wife. Later, when Robert walks her home, they are stopped by Slavi. Slavi strikes Alina for reportedly disrespecting a client. Robert doesn't move, and Slavi, who dismisses Alina as worthless, hands Robert a business card. Time ticks by, and Alina is noticeably absent from the diner. Eventually, the diner's manager spills the beans. Alina's in the ICU, severely beaten. Deeply concerned, Mr. McCall heads to the hospital, where he spots Mandy, a friend of Alina's. When Mr. McCall finally approaches, Mandy recoils in fear, questioning his identity. After establishing that he's simply a friend, Mandy reveals her entrapment in the same grim line of work as Alina. She confides that Alina was beaten by Slavi after she retaliated against one of his hits, and so she was made as an example. Later that night, Mr. McCall studies the business card given by Slavi and the CD gifted by Alina. He reckons that if he doesn't step in, Alina's life could be snuffed out. But there's a promise he made to his late wife, to never revert to his violent past. This choice gnaws at him, tearing him apart inside, but in the end, he resolves that action is necessary. As the night deepens, Robert tails Slavi to an apartment above a restaurant, the chosen meeting spot for Slavi and his cronies. Robert waltzes in, playing the cordial guest, and presents an envelope stuffed with $9,800. At first, they scoff at Robert, but Slavi eventually warms up to the offer, nearly 10 grand for Alina's freedom. Just as they shake on it, Slavi throws a curveball. The cash would only buy Alina a month's worth of freedom. Enraged, he rejects the deal and orders Robert to get lost. Robert then begins aligning the glass stalls on the desk, pointing them towards each man in the room. He strides to the door, but instead of exiting, he locks it and swings around. After scrutinizing each man, he starts the timer on his watch and heads for Slavi. The henchman nearest to the door pulls a gun, but Robert disarms him, breaking his arm and firing a shot into Slavi. He proceeds to wipe out the other 3 men, brutally wounding them multiple times and absolutely removing them from existence. Tevi lunges at him with a broken bottle, but Robert counters with a corkscrew from the counter, finishing him as well. Robert then stops his watch timer, pleased with his efficient work. He saunters over to Slavi, settling down next to him as life slowly fades away. Robert chillingly predicts Slavi's imminent end, contrasting it with Alina's continued existence. After the violent showdown, Robert heads home to freshen up, apologizing to his departed wife as he slips his wedding ring back on. In the aftermath of the murders, a Russian mobster named Teddy descends upon Boston, tasked with uncovering the killer. He joins forces with a cluster of corrupt cops to gather leads. He directs them to grab surveillance footage from all cameras within a 6-block radius and instructs them to take him to his lodgings. His high-handed demeanor ruffles the cops, but Teddy shoots back, stating he's here to handle the job they couldn't. The next morning, one of the crooked cops, Frank Masters, escorts Teddy to the office of John Looney, a local Irish mobster, continuing his investigation. John pleads ignorance about the murders, expressing his hatred for Russians, dubbing them insane and presumptuous. In response, Teddy dismisses John, claiming he lacks the intelligence to orchestrate such killings. He unveils his real motive for the visit, denouncing the Irish for pilfering from the Russians and warning that such behavior will no longer be tolerated. As the hostility escalates, Frank discreetly readies himself for a potential showdown. John, fuming at Teddy's threats, is met with a sudden barrage from Teddy. Frank shoots the two other men in the room, and Teddy doesn't let up, pummeling John over and over until he's lifeless. With the room now quiet, Teddy turns to Frank, declaring his arrival with this brutal message. Teddy receives a call from the top dog Pushkin. Teddy suggests that an outsider, not one of their usual rivals, committed the murders, commending the skill it would have required. Pushkin dismisses his speculations, demanding Teddy resolve the situation publicly to deter further incidents. Scanning still shots from security cameras, Teddy spots Robert entering the building. Meanwhile, Robert realizes Ralphie hasn't clocked in for his regular shift at work. When he queries the schedule manager, he learns Ralphie quit without a hint of a reason. Later, Robert visits a restaurant Ralphie's mother owns. Ralphie reveals he's taking a hiatus to help his mom spruce up the building following an electrical fire the previous night. Deemed accidental, Robert lends a hand in the cleanup. When they're done, he can't shake off his suspicion about the fire's cause, prodding Ralphie for the truth about what went down. Ralphie claims uncertainty, but it's clear to them both the fire was no accident. When night falls, two crooked cops, Ramar and Peterson, are spotted dining at Ralphie's mom's restaurant. They pressure her to wrap up business early and start squeezing her for protection money. They threaten another accident if she doesn't keep up with payments. Robert encounters them outside the restaurant and tells them he wants to report a crime. The officers dismiss him, beginning to drive off until one receives a personal call from Robert. He shows them a video he captured of their shakedown of a convenience store clerk, including their confession to sparking the restaurant fire. Robert can't help but laugh as he reveals that the recording is the only one he has. The officers threaten him, but Robert quickly disarms the pair and gives them a beating. He instructs them to return the extorted money or they'll be on headline news. Cornered, the corrupt cops have no option but to comply and later reimburse Ralphie's mother. In a different part of the city, Teddy pays a visit to Mandy, confronting her about the untruths she spouted during their earlier conversation. On his arrival in Boston, Teddy had inquired if Mandy knew anything about Alina, to which she claimed they weren't close. But he's recently uncovered that they are indeed good friends and demands to know when Mandy last spoke to Alina. Mandy admits that she visited Alina in the hospital a week ago and mentions the presence of a black man who seemed concerned about Alina. Satisfied with her honesty, Teddy thanks her, then abruptly puts her in a chokehold and squeezes until there's no movement. That same afternoon, Robert is spotted playing baseball with his co-workers. Ralphie appears, proudly sporting his new security guard uniform, having passed the requisite test. His peers are proud, and he tips his hat to Robert in acknowledgement. The next day at work, a criminal invades the Home Mart store, brandishing a gun at the cashier, Jenny, and demanding the money from the register. Robert approaches, unperturbed, and starts emptying the till, willing to let the event slide. However, when the robber demands Jenny's ring, the keepsake from her mother, she refuses to part with it. Robert takes in various details about the man, such as his tattoos and baseball cap. But when a family with children walks into the store, Robert chooses not to intervene, instead handing over the ring and tracking the man to his car to note his license plate number. The police inform them of a recent string of robberies connected to the same man. Robert reassures Ralphie, asserting that no amount of money is worth a life. A moment later, Robert retrieves a sledgehammer from the utility tools section. The following day, Jenny finds her ring back in the register, while Robert returns the wiped clean hammer to its place on the rack. As night approaches, Teddy visits McCall's home under the guise of a detective probing into the deaths of 5 Russians. He shows Robert a picture of Mandy's deceased body, passing off her death as an unfortunate accident. For the remainder of the day, Robert purchases various items for travel and fabricates a false prescription for methylzine, a medication commonly used to alleviate motion sickness during flights. Later, Teddy gets his crew to trail Robert to the diner with intentions of capturing and killing him. However, Robert is aware of their presence and singles out the lime worker, who enters the diner as an undercover henchman for Teddy. He points out the man's unusually soft hands for someone supposedly working on power lines. Simultaneously, a truck pulls up in front of the diner, obscuring Teddy and Frank's view. The undercover man brandishes an Uzi and instructs Robert to head out to the car. Unflustered, Robert activates his stopwatch and studies the man, swiftly using his book to disarm the thug and kill him on the table. He then plunges the diner into darkness and walks out, covertly snapping photos of Teddy and his men in their car. Teddy orders his men to bring Robert in alive, and they begin pursuit. Robert deliberately leaves a trail of bloody handprints on a wall to mislead Teddy and manages to isolate one of the corrupt cops. After incapacitating the officer, Robert escapes with his phone. At home, Robert attends to a gunshot wound by boiling honey and applying it to the injury. Anticipating Teddy and his men, he manages to leave his apartment unnoticed, deliberately leaving the bathroom sink running. From the vantage point of another building, Robert observes Teddy's crew via hidden cameras planted in his apartment. Upon entering Robert's apartment, Teddy's men discover receipts for a flight to Mexico and an empty prescription bottle, suggesting Robert's intended escape. However, Teddy dismisses this evidence as a deliberate misdirection, asserting that Robert is watching them even at that moment. Meanwhile, Robert pays a visit to his old friends, Brian and Susan Plummer, both of whom were former colleagues at the agency he used to work for. He approaches Susan, confident in her ability to gather essential information about Teddy and his employers. While Susan ventures off to the agency to identify Teddy, Brian expresses his relief at seeing Robert alive. It is disclosed that Robert had faked his death years prior, a truth Susan had always suspected, deeming Robert too smart to fall victim to a simple car bombing. Returning home via helicopter, Susan imparts her findings to Robert. The men Robert eliminated were part of the Russian mafia led by Vladimir Pushkin. Teddy, whose real name is revealed to be Nikolai, is a fixer who is called upon whenever Pushkin needs a problem resolved. It also emerges that the corrupt cops, Ramar and Peterson, were on Pushkin's payroll, but they were recently found dead. Susan concludes her report by issuing a warning to Robert. These men will stop at nothing until he and everyone he cares about are dead. Returning to the city the next day, Robert tracks down Frank and cuttingly lures him outside by setting off his car alarm. Frank, paranoid yet determined to shut off the alarm, proceeds to his garage, unaware that Robert is lying in wait for him. He traps him in his car, which is rigged with a hose to funnel carbon monoxide inside, effectively creating a makeshift gas chamber. Desperate for information on Pushkin, Robert pressures Frank, who, after enduring the toxic environment for a while, agrees to cooperate. Guided by Frank, Robert is led to a warehouse where the Russians store their stash. There, he confronts the man in charge, coercing him to make his men surrender. He then proceeds to lock everyone in the warehouse's meat freezer, effectively securing